And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again showing several lows here along the Aleutians, keeping it wet and unsettled there with the strongest winds here over toward the eastern Aleutians, but not too bad wind-wise there. A weak low here with some light snow over the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, up in toward the Bering Strait, and another system here in the Gulf of Alaska, increasing wind and snow for the southeast coast throughout the night tonight, and then tomorrow periods of snow, especially in the central and northern areas, mixing with rain along the coast and in across Prince of Wales Island in the afternoon. Light snow possible as far west as the eastern Kenai Peninsula, which includes Prince William Sound, and maybe some light snow here over the east side. Areas of light snow possible from the Seward Peninsula into the lower and maybe mid-Yukon River Valley down to the Kuskokwim Valley, down in toward Togiak Bay. Weakening front spreads some precipitation into the Alaska Peninsula, but the strongest winds will be on the backside of that low, right over Adak and Atka. And then for Thursday, a break here in the east central Aleutians, scattered snow showers along the southwest coast and the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island as well. Next big storm spreading wind and rain and snow into the Aleutians from about Adak westward to Shimianatu. And a stronger front brings some pretty good increase in the wind and precipitation over the southern panhandle. Coastal water forecast there for the south coast tomorrow. South winds 25 knots, and the north coast here, east winds 40 knots. Good gales there with 17 to 20 foot seas. Southeast at 20 for Lynn Canal, southeast 25 for Stevens Passage, and Clarence Strait, southeast winds at 30 knots. Then for the day on Thursday, east to southeast winds, 30 knots there for the south coast, and the central coast, east 25 knots. Not much different up here to the north, east winds 20 to 25 knots. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage, south winds at 20, and Clarence Strait, south winds 30 knots. And for the eastern North Gulf Coast, northeast winds for the day Wednesday at 25 to 35 knots. Light winds here for Prince William Sound out of the north at 10 knots. And the western North Gulf Coast, north winds 20 knots. Cook Inlet, variable winds at 10 knots. And northwest 25 for Kamishak Bay. A little bit stronger there for the Barren Islands at 30 knots. And then for the day on Thursday, Cook Inlet, north winds 10 to 20 knots. 15 knot winds now for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands out of the north. North Gulf Coast, pretty easy. Northeast winds 15 knots, seas 5 feet. Prince William Sound, light variable winds. And then for Kodiak Island, for Wednesday, west to northwest winds 20 knots. Alaska Peninsula, east winds 15 to 25 knots. And Bristol Bay, variable at 10 knots with 3 foot seas. Bristol Bay on Thursday, northwest at 15 knots. Otherwise, the Alaska Peninsula here, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. And north to northeast winds for Kodiak Island at 15 knots. Eastern Aleutians for tomorrow. East to southeast winds 30 knots. Gale warnings, Adak and Atka. North to northeast winds at 35 knots. And small craft advisories for Amchitka Island. North to northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And east to northwest winds for the western Aleutians at 20 knots. And then on Thursday, looks like storm warnings coming in to Shimianatu to about Kiska Island. Those southeast winds increasing to 50 knots throughout the day and into the afternoon. Gale warnings into Amchitka Peninsula, Amchitka Island. Adak and Atka, south to southeast winds at 25 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, northwest winds 20 to 30 knots. And for the southwest coast for Wednesday, southern Nunivak Island, winds will be south at 15 knots. Although for the Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, north winds at 20 knots, northeast at 20 for Norton Sound, north at 20 for St. Matthew Island, and the Pribilofs, northeast winds at 20 knots. And for Thursday, small craft advisories now for St. Paul and St. George, north at 25, seas just under 10 feet. North at 20, St. Matthew Island, north 20 also for Norton Sound. St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast, north to northwest, 25 knots, northwest 20 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. And for the eastern Boulevard Sea tomorrow, east to northeast winds, 15 knots, extending to the central coast. Brisk wind advisories for the western Arctic coast, east to northeast winds, 25 knots, and the Chukchi Sea, north winds 15 to 25 knots. And for Thursday, Chukchi Sea, brisk wind advisories continue. North winds at 25 knots, 20 to 30 knot northeast winds for the western Arctic coast. Really laying down on the central coast for Thursday, 5 knots out of the north. And west winds 10 to 15 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea.